All right. Hello and welcome everyone to a first impressions video for Yareli. So, Yareli just came out and I have spent a little bit of time with her and I have some thoughts. So, this Warframe is obviously the K-Drive Warframe. So that's going to be a big part of this. That is a big thing here. And before we get any further into this, that is kind of the only thing here, is that she is the K-Drive Warframe. And we're going to go into details as to why. So first and foremost, this is a no Forma build, but I also don't think it needs Forma, and I also don't think that you should invest Forma into Yareli. Also, just as kind of a blanket thing here, I think of all of the new content that was added in the Sisters of Parvos patch, I think Yareli is probably like the least interesting of it. So yeah, this is a build for just base Yareli. If you would like to use her, you can utilize all of her powers this way. That being said, the power that you're mainly going to be utilizing is Marylina, which is her main thing. She gets on the Marylina, she gets 75% damage reduction. It has a bunch of health. It's almost certainly always going to be enough health that the 25% damage you're taking is going to matter more than the 75% of that damage that Marylina is going to be taking. And then we also have sea snares, which have a very small amount of scaling damage that is only really relevant in like sub-level 60 content, and even then you can only have 15 of these persist at any given time, so even making them cheap is not particularly useful. Then we have aqua blades, which do constantly proc slash, but not at a high enough damage level to be relevant. They will stumble enemies, which is fine. Their range is non-moddable. Their duration is moddable. They do a very low amount of damage. And then we have Riptide, which has a super, super long casting animation that does bunch enemies up and does not tend to blow them super far away. So it's like a minorly useful grouping tool that has a very low base range. You're only getting 21 meters here with a 175% range build, so you could increase this if you wanted to with like an overextended and lower the strength levels if you wanted to. But if you lower the strength too much, then Marylina becomes a little bit more at risk, which you could option select to do. So this is the base build that I went with if you're just using Yareli. The big part about Yareli that's very important, that is maybe the most useful bit about her, is her passive, which is you get plus 100% critical chance for secondary weapons when she has been moving for at least 1.5 seconds, which you're going to want to constantly be moving on Marylina. So we're going to show this stuff off and how it works in the test that we've been showing stuff off with, which is this level 180 test. So I am going to turn on invincibility to show off the damage potential of her abilities, so you guys can really see it. And we are going to kill these corrupted ancients first, so you can see like the full damage without the DR being applied to the enemies. So I think that'd be a little unfair to show. So sea snares, we're going to throw a bunch of these out and grab all these enemies. It does grab them, and you can see the types of damage that we're getting. I will point out that Panzer here, putting the viral on these enemies, is actually doing more damage than Yareli is doing here. So that is a consideration here. Like the viral procs from this companion are better than this ability by a long shot. And we can turn on aqua blades, and if I get real close to these enemies, the slash procs will start, but I mean, it's still very much out damaged by the viral procs that the Panzer is putting on them. You can see the damage is not particularly good in any way, shape, or form. Like they will die technically, but I mean, not at any kind of a rate that you would want. And I mean, these are armored enemies. They're weak to these slash procs in theory, right? So yeah, there's that. You can see the new threshold for the mercies being consistent on the heavies though. So if you needed a super low damage ability to get the enemies to those thresholds, that's a thing that you could do, because you can now see that. If you wanted to, like, wow, you could see a mercy animation for once. So I guess that's technically a thing you're capable of doing because this ability is such low damage. But also, we have her 4, which we can just show as this, because you're usually going to be using it on groups. It usually dumps them into a relatively neat pile, especially if there are corrupted ancients involved. But you are busy during this entire cast, so it's not like you can fire an AoE weapon into this, while it is, putting them into a nice, neat ball for you. That is not a thing you're capable of doing, and you can see that its damage is not great. It's like, if I cast this enough times, I mean, sure, I'm going to get damage eventually. But it's not great in terms of damage. You really need an AoE weapon to clean these enemies up, and it's just kind of putting them together. You can see whenever the Ancients die that it is like more, like it doesn't make such a nice pile of them, but they're still kind of close to one another. And that's basically what we're dealing with Yareli's kit. So if you were going to play Yareli, this is the way that I actually would tell you to handle groups of enemies. I'm using a good secondary weapon. I did a video very recently on what I thought good secondary weapons were going to be going into this update, and I can very safely tell you that the mushroom gun is very good with Yareli and the way that she wants to play generally. So, these bunch of enemies, which we're missing a corrupted crewman, I'll just throw him back in. Bunch of enemies, level 180. You jump on your board, you group them up, and you shoot them with a secondary weapon that's AoE. You can use your secondaries only while you're on the board, so you just shoot them with a secondary weapon. You get that extra crit. Also, by the way, if you're using an explosive secondary, you will sometimes get knocked off your board by it, because that's just the way it works. Even if you use primed sure-footed, you still get knocked off, which is probably not the way it should be. But yeah, that's generally what you're going to be doing. You're going to be using the 4 to group them up, and you're going to use an AoE secondary weapon to kill the enemies. That is kind of your best option as Yareli, because as we saw, the 1 doesn't really do damage, and the 3 also doesn't really do damage. So they're not particularly worth casting. That being said, if you would like to more effectively use Yareli because you like K driving around, which is the only reason that I can determine would be why you'd want to play this Warframe, you can instead do this build, which adds Gloom to the build. Obviously, this requires you to subsume a Sevagoth, which is a considerable cost because that does mean you have farmed Void Storms. But if you're interested in some of the new weapons, you're probably going to be doing that anyway. So you can subsume Gloom onto Yareli. It really doesn't matter as long as it's not her 2 or her 4. You could get rid of Aqua Blades if you like the 1 better. For me personally, I'm not going to cast either of those abilities, so I just replaced the 1. And this is going to function very, very similarly, except for, of course, you don't need any duration because your 4 doesn't use duration, your 2 doesn't use duration, and you only need, like, a little bit of duration to be, basically so that the efficiency that you're getting from a max streamline and fleeting is enough to have low drain on Gloom, so you can't use transient fortitude instead of energy conversion, for example. But other than that, you're basically going to grab an energy orb, turn Gloom on, have a big slow and a lifesteal and an AoE, and you're going to build up adaptation and have the damage reduction for Marolina, and you're just going to ride around in your surfboard and shoot stuff. If they were to fix primed sure-footed, how I would hope that they would, to make it so that you cannot be knocked off your board, you would take this build, add some Forma to it, and then you would put primed sure-footed up here in the Exila slot. And that would complete the build. Without that, I don't think there's any real reason to add Forma to this build, because I'm pretty sure this is exactly what I would run. And yeah, and if you want to see how it works, it's going to look pretty similar. Going to turn the 1 on, spawn these guys in here, jump on Marolina, and absolutely no surprise, I would hope. Gonna just drift back and forth, do some hops and jumps, and shoot at the enemies with your AoE secondary weapon. Or your non-AoE secondary weapon, if that suits your fancy. Yeah, Gloom is a nice, persistent AoE. You do have to turn it on while you're not on Marolina. You cannot turn it off while you are riding Marolina, as you cannot activate Helminth's abilities while you are riding around. So there are a number of abilities that you'd want to activate more than once, such as, say, like, I don't know, Ash's Shuriken, for example, I suppose, if you wanted to put an armor strip on her. You cannot do that while riding around on Marolina, so active skills like that are not great. Makes Gloom a fantastic candidate, as it is a good low drain ability that does not drain when there are not enemies around, as you can see right now. That also adds to the protection of Yareli, because if we, for example, just turn Gloom off and let these enemies shoot me, you will notice that Yareli is not the toughest character. She's still taking 25% of that damage, and at high levels, that's definitely still enough to kill her. Gloom just adds that extra little layer of protection so that you don't die. And of course, the lifesteal is nice once you've built up a high enough amount of adaptation stacks. If you're just taking very small amounts of damage after the damage reduction is done with, you can heal that stuff back up from the damage that you are outputting. But yeah, she's playable. I mean, it's certainly, like, you can ride around on the K drive. This does, as I surmised it would, get stuck very easily in tile sets that are very cluttered. If you're taking this through like the Grenier Galleon, it's an absolute nightmare. I'm sure when many of you are leveling her in Sanctuary Onslaught, you will note that certain tiles are an absolute gigantic pain. And yeah, she kind of just doesn't have anything going on besides Marulina. This ability is underwhelming. Her Aqua Blades don't really do damage, and also they don't have like a lot of verticality, so like if you're having to jump over things, they're going to be hitting literally nothing, just as I surmised that they would whenever she was previewed. And her one doesn't do good damage, and there's not enough of them, and it's not worth casting. You'd be much better served just shooting the enemies in front of you rather than putting them in sea snares or whatever else. But yeah, that's Yareli. Not great. She's basically skateboard only, secondary weapon only in Naros. And even then, she is not as survivable as an Inaros would be. So yeah, it's not great. I mean, if you like how she looks, I guess you could technically play this Warframe. It's a thing that you can technically do it. So that's Yareli. And thankfully, after this video, we get to talk about a lot of the good things about this update. But yeah, that's where Yareli's out. See ya tomorrow.